At any time you are conscious of a tingling sensation, you may obtain immediate relief by screaming. Don't be embarrassed about opening your mouth and letting rip with all you've got, because the person in the seat right next to you will probably be screaming too. And remember this, a scream at the right time may save your life.
Hello and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1959 film The Tingler, starring the amazing Vincent Price, who has probably one of my favourite transatlantic accents. It is a heavily horror-leaning science fiction story where the science is pretty shaky, but it is very good fun. The film is more known for its marketing and gimmickry, which director William Castle was known for. So with that, on to my wonderful guests. Scott Higgins is the Professor of Film at Wesleyan University, where he is also the curator of the Wesleyan Cinema Archives. Welcome back to the show, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Joining Scott is Matthew Rule-Jones, who is a Senior Lecturer of Film Studies at the University of Exeter. Welcome back to the show, Matt. How are you doing?
Bless you. I'm very good. How are you?
Yeah. I don't expect you to ask me questions like that.
You're honest, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that is, I've talked to Matt about this last time. He needs to not ask me how I'm doing, because I think
Gotta get over that,
yeah. Everything's fine. There's nothing even remotely worrying going on in the world. So it's
no.
That's great. Yeah.
So let's start with the man who is famous for his gimmickry and marketing, which is the maker of this film, William Castle. Can we go to Matt, you first?
William Castle is, he's one of my favourite figures in film history. He is a wonder of a beast. Because he is part filmmaker and part showman. So he'd have been as happy back in the days of kind of the travelling circus, I think, as anything else. He is known as kind of the king of Ballyhoo, really. So most of his films have some sort of gimmick that is used to sell them. He's a marketing master in that regard. You know, the films vary in quality, shall we say, although I do think The Tingler is perhaps one of his finest. There's always something extra to get people into the auditorium. And this really does take us back to kind of the roll up crowd at the fairground. So in this film, in The Tingler, it's Percepto, which is a really fancy name for a small buzzer put at the bottom of a cinema seat to simulate the kind of the creature in the film attacking you. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But this is not unusual for William Castle. So his previous film, the House on Haunted Hill, had a skeleton that floated above the cinema or above the heads of the patrons of the cinema in some showings. He had all sorts of kind of other bells and whistles, actors playing nurses and doctors in cinemas in order to kind of make it look like people had fainted in horror. And he offered life insurance policies to people in case they died of fright in his films. It's the ultimate in showmanship. And that's really what William Castle's known for.
Do you know where the term ballyhoo comes from? It's a fantastic word, but does it have like an old history? Okay, no.
Yeah, it's tied into that kind of the circus and showmanship and that kind of history. And I think is reused by film promoters and now cinema historians in a way that kind of draws that notion of the ringmaster through. But it's something that had been going on in cinemas really since the dawn of cinema. It's nothing new.
Scott, can I ask you a little bit about William Castle and about his many shenanigans in the marketing world? Before you do that, I wanted to quickly mention his background. He was an orphan at 11 and he was raised by a sister, and he was inspired at the age of 13 by the amazing Bela Lugosi, who he saw repeatedly play Dracula. And he said that he realised then that it was his purpose in life to scare the pants off people, which is apparently a quote from his autobiography.
The name of his autobiography is I'm Going to Scare the Pants Off America, which is great.
He had a calling.
Yeah, he had a calling. And it's great also that I learned from you yesterday about the Bela Lugosi connection, because Dracula is a horrible melodrama, and that's exactly what the Tingler is. So we know that William Castle kind of ran away from home and joined the theater, like traveled with the touring show of Dracula. And then what one of his first productions was a stage play in Connecticut, my hometown, that he cast a woman with a German last name. His last name was Schloss, but he translated it into Castle for to anglicize it. And apparently there was a rule that said that if you're going to stay, if you are, I don't know if this is true. Okay, we should probably like
There's
say that about
many fun rumors. Yeah,
everything we say about William Castle. But the story is that in order to produce a German, in order for a German to produce a play in the U.S., it should be based on a German property. So he wrote a play, then had it translated into German, and then back into English, and claimed to be producing a German play.
but
And
apparently this was also because he'd said he'd written it, and then he went off for the weekend to write it.
Well,
this is all rumor again. Like
yeah,
he was
all
like, I'll
written,
just bash
right.
out a play.
Yeah. After he got the theater, then worry about the play. And allegedly, the Adolf Hitler's government got in touch and offered him to do a showing in Germany. And so he ran an ad proclaiming that the show's leading lady, he said, like the girl who said no to Hitler, she refused to join a German production of the play. And allegedly, he faked vandalism of the theater with swastikas so that it looked like he was standing up against fascists. So ethics, I think, are very flexible for Castle.
In the content of the film as well, that I think Vincent Price's ethics are also very questionable. But we'll get to that
bit
later.
of projection, yeah.
Oh, no, absolutely. If the means are to get people to pay to get into his seat, he'll do it. He goes on to Columbia, and he does kind of B production work at Columbia. He gets a middle budget film called When Strangers Marry in 1944, more melodrama, and it got good reviews for that. He produces Orson Welles' Lady from Shanghai in 1948. And then as Columbia is failing, he kind of goes independent, works for different studios. He directs Paramount's 3D Western Fort T in 1953. And then he sets up independent shop and starts making films on his own. And he makes them completely competently. There is a kind of careful, not too innovative, but well-made, workmanlike quality to his films that I think comes from growing up in Studio B films. But the difference was, for his independent production, as you mentioned, was to always give the audience something extra, and that extra was Ballyhoo, was a gimmick. And that he's, as you noted, he's joining a long tradition. I hadn't thought about the name Ballyhoo, and it was commonly used in studio press kits from the 1920s through the 1950s. And it referred to anything that they were trying to get the theater owner to do on behalf of their film. So usually Ballyhoo wasn't something funded by the studio, but they're trying to convince theater owners to put up big displays. And like a common one, you see this a lot, is to create a big telescope in your lobby, and at the end of the telescope put a picture of whoever is starring in the film and have a sign, get a glimpse of the new star. I mean, that was completely generic. They did that everywhere. So this was, I don't know where the term comes from. Variety, the famous trade magazine, shortened it to Bally, and it just became part of Variety speak, And so building these gimmicks into the films was a great way to convince exhibitors to do it. So if there's a moment when a skeleton flies flies somewhere in the film, and if the advertising material he put together says this is going to be shown in emergo, which is not 3D, it's emergo, then it's incumbent on the theater owner to actually rent the plastic skeleton, wire it up, and put electric eyes in it and pull it out. So he's very clever in that regard.
The concept of these kind of elaborate marketing gimmicks, and you've got ambulances, you've got people screaming and all of that kind of stuff. I just wonder if nowadays we're almost too straight-laced for it, because there's a story you told me, Matt, in which they went very far with their kind of promotion of a particular actress during 2 of her films, I believe.
This is the Florence Lawrence story, which is one of my favorite pieces of film history. Every time I'm in Los Angeles, I go and visit Florence Lawrence's grave, because this story, I adore it. I'm in love with Florence Lawrence as a result. So this was one of the early stars of the film. They call her the Biograph Girl, because of the types of films that she made. She was, some report her as the first film star, although, what does that really mean? And there's all sorts of contested claims around that. But Florence Lawrence was, really well loved. And then, unfortunately, her publicist had to say to people that she had died in a trolley accident in New York City. She'd been run over by a streetcar.
Very tragic.
I know, it was heartbreaking, I'm sure. People were weeping in the streets. But if you wanted to say your goodbye to Florence Lawrence, finally let go of this star, you could go and see her latest movie, which was releasing conveniently enough that weekend, and so on and so on and so on. So that then got bumper ticket sales for the movie. And things went quiet and people started to move on, only to be told that Florence Lawrence had been found alive and well. And if you want a proof of this for yourself, you could go see her latest movie. So
it's also coming out that weekend.
Yes, exactly. Conveniently enough. So it worked twice over as me. So this is kind of the long history of this sort of promotional fun and games, shall we say, in cinemas that, goes right the way through to the 1950s, when Tingler is kind of released at the tail end of it, was kind of a high period for this. So we'd had monster movies where fake newspapers had been encouraged to be printed, at least. Who knows if any of this actually happened or not. But Gorgo was one of the monster movies of the period, where they had fake newspapers ready to be ordered along with posters and so on for the film, along with kind of stills for the lobby and so on. You could order these kind of fake newspapers saying a monster has been released in your town. And if you want to see how that plays out, you can come to the cinema. Or where they'd put fake monster prints on the floor, on the pavements of the city that led to the cinema. So people who followed the monster footprints would find their way into the monster screening. So it's, it kind of finds its heyday in the 1950s. And William Castle is absolutely part of that.
And I just wanted to mention with Florence Lawrence, apparently she didn't know about her own death until she read about it in the newspaper. So she saw, I don't know if that's true or if it's kind of like plausible deniability, but I love that story.
But I think partly it's the myth that's important here, right? Because this stuff captures public. It's like Orson Welles and the Attack of the Martians, right? Who knows if people were actually scared out of their minds by that or not? But the myth tells us that they were all calling the police. And it's the myth that matters, because it's that sense that this could have been possible, that there could have been people being scared out of their minds and needing life insurance policies that drives people to the cinema.
Yes, we do like a good story. I can be quite straight-laced about stuff like that, but it's fun to learn about. Scott, you mentioned the word avant-garde when you were describing William Castle, and I kind of know what you're talking about, but can you elaborate on his, I suppose, let's go into the setup of the Tingler, what all the gimmickry was, and how he sits between this kind of quite experimental style.
Yeah, I think experimental is a better word for it. Just to note, like in between Florence Lawrence and William Castle, there was Universal Studios, and so even with Frankenstein, which is, I think they did Dracula first, Frankenstein their second big monster film with Boris Karloff. That film opens with a warning to the audience from the producer Carl Laemmle to the audience to warn them that this may be disturbing. And if you find this too difficult, well, you've been warned. And then he walks off camera and the film begins. during that run, there were some probably unsubstantiated claims of people suffering heart attacks during the movie. And that became a tag for universal publicity. They would park ambulances outside of the theater owner, not necessarily the studio. Theater owner would park ambulances outside of the theater just in case someone should be scared to death by Frankenstein, which I teach horror. I show that every time I do. It scares nobody.
But I think the concept of what's scary,
exactly.
The concept of what's scary is different. Because even in the beginning of this, when those people are screaming, it's hilarious, but it's such kind of like, I mean, a scream is quite terrifying in itself, even when it's funny. So you can see where it kind of straddles fun, humor and terror.
Well, that brings us to what I think is like the avant-garde or experimental side of William Castle, that he's interested in doing anything with the medium to directly address the audience and to drag them into a game, right? Really, first to tempt them into the theater. But once you're there, he creates different relationships with film than nearly any other filmmaker. And he begins by directly telling the audience, he comes on screen in The Tingler and warns the audience about what is about to happen and instructs them that the way to overcome the mysterious tingling sensation is to scream. So there's an invitation to participate, but also an invitation to break like a very strong cultural mores, which is to scream in public, which is kind of why I love this movie. It gives me an excuse with a group of other people to just let them rip and scream. That direct address to the audience and that call to the audience to break social codes has a long tradition, partly in horror, but I think in horror and in surrealism. So the link I want to make is between the French theater of the grotesque, the Grand Guignol, which in the early 19th, late 18th, early 19th, right through the 1930s, was a showcase for horrible events, short plays written that featured grotesque and impossible things on stage before the audience. And part of the game was to show the audience such horrible things that you can't believe it isn't real, and you are offended. You go to be offended because it's crossing lines. And the Surrealists would love to go to the Grand Guignol, and they picked up this kind of direct confrontation between art and audience through impossible juxtapositions, right? That fed into, you think of Louis Buñuel and Andalusian Dog, that begins with the cutting of an eyeball, that's an avant-garde surrealist film that leads almost, it's very closely tied to cutting open a woman's spine and pulling out the lobster centipede creature, that we're daring you to sit in the seats. We're going to confront you with things that you can't possibly see. And we're going, in Castle's place, we're going to erase the line between the story of the film and the world in which you live. That there's, and we're going to do that by formal experimentation. So in The Tingler we'll get to, one of the many, like there are maybe 4 wonders of The Tingler. And maybe like the second or third wonder of The Tingler is this sequence. It's a black and white film. A husband, Ollie Higgins, no relation, is attempting to scare his wife to death. She, Martha Higgins, is a deaf mute and cannot scream. He has caught on, because of Vincent Price, to the existence of a Tingler, which if you cannot scream and release the fear, this creature will crush your spinal cord and kill you. So he decides to have a go at her by scaring her. And he puts together this whole horror show in which he wears a mask. He puts on this fuzzy, monster arm. And she goes into the bathroom and she turns on the sink, and blood runs from the sink, and then blood is overflowing the bathtub, and a hand comes up through it.
And the thing is that this is red blood in a black and white film.
You're right. I'm getting right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
That's
So
why it's
William
shocking.
Castle is stealing from Diabolique, right? The French thriller that was a hit a few years before with the whole bathtub scare sequence. But he's doing it one better by having red blood appear in a completely black and white film. Now, if you think about this, it only makes first, it makes no sense, like many things from the Tingler. But no one in the film would have noticed that this was red blood instead of a black and white world, unless these characters you think are experiencing a black and white world, right? This is strictly and
This is
only
for you.
the audience, for you. And it calls attention as soon as it happens to the fact that you're watching a black and white movie. It makes no sense. Like 3D that reaches out of the screen and reminds you, oh, it's all an illusion, I'm watching a movie. This is a moment that the Surrealists would have loved. It breaks that the world of the film and says it's all artificial and I can do whatever I want. By the way, red blood in a black and white world. So it's a great idea. In my humble opinion, it was executed terribly.
Yeah.
It looks quite bad. It's very clear that what he did was shoot the actress and the bathroom scene in black and white and then rear project it in front of a sink and in front of a bathtub.
Because there's some question as to how it's done. Now this is how you're like there's no question. But
this is my theory.
The sink scene there's no back projection there. And then I was thinking, I wonder if they've just painted everything grey and then kind of
it's a grey sink with red
and a grey wall behind it,
red paint in it. That's easier. And then the bathtub scene is a bathtub that's shot in color. But then the back projection is black and white. And you could tell from the grain that this is what happened. So anyway, poorly done, but highly experimental.
Matt, can we talk a little bit about what you call a brink film and why you like them?
So we talked last time you very generously hosted me, and we talked about The Blob as a film where the teenager was kind of emerging as a category but hadn't quite become James Dean yet. So here we've got a film that sits, kind of neatly between the old horrors and the new, where the screaming of a banshee or the cackle of a witch are no longer really scary anymore in a world where the atom has been let out of its box. I'm not arguing that this is a nuclear horror film by any stretch, but I do think kind of the world has moved on since the gothic horrors of Universal that we were talking about, were really kind of what was cutting edge in horror. So we find ourselves here wondering what on earth is scary now. And I mean, this film has some answers for us. Firstly, that science is scary, that biology is scary, that things lurk at the bottom of your spine and you don't know it, and they might just break you if you don't scream. But also that this is a film that is so kind of run through with this kind of burgeoning counterculture drug scene, right? So LSD is legal in the States at the time, right? And this is a film with a lot of LSD in it, actually, much more than you think at first. There's all sorts of insinuations.
I love the scene where you just see him sitting there with the title of the book, which says something like, how to inject LSD or something like that.
Right. The title of the book is actually printed on the back cover of the book, so it makes a better shot. That's William Castle all over, right? Makes no sense, but looks cool. So LSD is kind of run through this movie, and there's all sorts of insinuations that is he giving his patients it, and is he taking it himself, and then he does take it himself. Then you get this kind of psychological horror sequence that's kind of partly, very much actually in his mind. We're entering into a slightly different kind of horror here. I'm not saying this is pure psychological horror. It's clearly not. It's, as Scott was very rightly saying, it's built on shock, right? On the shock of the red of the bathtub and so forth, which is very much William Castle's game.
But there is a lot of mention of psychiatry and insanity and all those kind of things that are huge at that time, I think.
Absolutely. And this is the time when in London, we're starting to get things like trepanation, people kind of boring into their own skulls to let out the horrors, and this kind of pseudoscience of the mind bubbling up. So then to get, your quintessential mad scientist playing around with people's heads via drugs, via perception, rather than, the mad scientists of old messing around with corpses that they can resurrect. It's clear that horror's in the head. And so when we get into the 1960s proper after this movie, we find ourselves in a world of Psycho, where the horror is very much in
1
the
year
mind.
later.
Yeah, exactly. 1 year, right? The Tingler finds us at a moment in history where old horrors are fading and new ones are bubbling up. And that's what I mean when I say it's a brink film. It's a film between two worlds.
I just want to mention, because one of my favourite books of all time is called Acid Dreams, the CIA, LSD and the 60s Rebellion. So
Right.
I just want to recommend that to anyone who wants to learn more about the CIA involvement in LSD. But apparently in the mid to late 50s, it was used in research to kind of induce temporary mental illness. They did a lot
Yes.
more research after that. And also, Cary Grant at this time had already started his LSD sessions, and I just had to mention that because I love Cary Grant. But
Marvellous.
apparently they did wonders for him. I wanted to also talk about the 1950s as the golden era of psychoanalysis. So all of that stuff is very heavily, increasingly in films, you do have Psycho and you'll have Marnie coming. There's a lot of films that use all those kind of things. And this film is heavily talking about psychiatry. And at the beginning, and that's a question I wanted to ask. So at the beginning, you go from the screams of the floating heads to a man who's about to be executed. And then old Ollie Higgins comes by and kind of mentions that that's his brother-in-law. Do we in the end find out that it wasn't his brother-in-law and his brother-in-law was innocent? Is that implied? I don't know. Or was his brother-in-law a terrible killer and so it's in the family?
Yeah, by marriage. Right?
Yeah.
I'd say just one of many unanswered questions in the screenplay.
Yeah.
This film is rife with things that go nowhere. Even as you mentioned, the ambiguity about whether Vincent Price is administering LSD to Martha Higgins. It wouldn't take too much to clarify that for the audience. And that would have made the color black and white thing make a little more sense. But it's simply not spelled out.
No.
It's so heavily implied. He's definitely doing it. I'm a firm believer.
Because he is injecting
I disagree
something.
with you on that.
Oh, really?
But I don't know why. I think it's because it's a different bottle. The bottle's
I feel like
not
his
the white
ethics
one.
are so wrong. That it's kind of
sure.
I don't know.
I'm not saying
I have
that
no
there's
idea.
an ethical argument for him not doing it. I'm
No.
saying there's a continuity argument for him, which given this film, continuity means very little either. So we might as well. But the point is they don't close these. They don't tie the knots.
They don't
on
answer
these
the questions. No.
narrative threads. So maybe that was his brother. He had a pass to the execution, which also entitles him to see the autopsy. Apparently, that's how things work.
Yeah.
So
it is brilliant. And I think the brother-in-law getting executed at the start, I think because you go from the screams to this man who seems like he's in some kind of padded cell and he's screaming and is he innocent? And so that is what is part of the scare. But then it doesn't get clarified if he was an innocent man.
But it's flavour, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting about William Castle's film is he takes all of reference to psychiatry, but then everything becomes somatic and physical. So it's not that we have repressed urges that will cause us to act against ourselves, right? The unconscious wish that will come out of us. It's that, no, there's literally a centipede in your spine. And if you're unable to express that anxiety, that tension, that centipede will snap your spine. So let's take this kind of Freudian idea of undirected unconscious energy and just make it literal.
Right, exactly.
And not explore it beyond that, I don't think. But it's kind of cool,
If psychiatry is all about the metaphor, then William Castle is a much more literal gentleman than that.
I think I need to go on to Vincent Price at this point because he comes up with the science that makes this science fiction. And again, it makes next to zero sense. But because he is Vincent Price and he has this gravitas, he just says things which make next to no sense. And we just kind of go, yeah, that's definitely true.
Anything that can exert such tremendous pressure on the spinal column must be something you can see, touch, hold in your hand. It may exist for only a fraction of a second, but during that fraction, there's something inside every frightened person that's as solid as steel, and probably stronger. Oh, by the way, I think I found a name for it. The Tingler. You like it?
Tingler. Why not? Since we don't know what it is yet, we can't give it a Latin name.
He speaks with conviction. Um, and I think that's like his star quality for me is his ability to project to the audience a character who absolutely believes what the character is saying. Just beneath that, there's a wink at the audience. But the wink at the audience never comes at the expense of the character. He's capable of playing it completely straight and then really going for it. I mean, really going for, I guess, chewing the scenery in his quest for characterization of madness. He also comes from theater, and then Fox was developing him into kind of a leading man. He's in Laura opposite Gene Tierney, but then he also starts doing like character bits and villain roles, and he really finds that he fits those quite well. This is by no means his first sci-fi horror film. He had been recently he was in House of Wax for Warner Brothers, and he would go on to star in Roger Corman's films that were adapting Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and that was Corman kind of battling Hammer Studios and trying to give these horror films a sense of prestige, and that's what Vincent Price could give you, the prestige of a real actor who is also quite silly and not afraid of being
it's an interesting balance because it is quite hammy the way he acts.
Oh,
but it's also as you've said, it's completely believable. Like it's a rare gift, I feel.
It's maybe just to deliver the lines he has to deliver, right? Measuring things out in micromilligrams, which don't exist. And you believe, yes, he uses micromilligrams of LSD.
It sounds super sciencey. I'm on board with it.
A mini milligram, less than a right.
But actually, what's interesting for me there about the hammy believability of it is that what he's doing is playing caricatures, right? He's the mad scientist. He's that kind of vaguely Dracula-y figure within all of this. Like, so you're not necessarily buying into him being a real character. It's not the performance of a character you buy. Right. It's the performance of this kind of familiar archetype that you're buying.
I think that's also what I'm talking about, is that in this film, he goes from, like, hardworking, serious scientist, and then he's like this really loving brother-in-law, and then he's a really kind of jealous and potentially murderous partner who admittedly has a terrible wife, but still he's ready to frighten her to death almost. And he just changes, and then he goes back to being like a really reasonable scientist. And then he kind of injects this random woman with like potentially LSD.
That last change when he says to his partner, yes, but now we've gone too far. Like, we had to, but we've gone too far. Like, where does this man suddenly think he's gone too far?
Is that at the end when they say we shouldn't have messed with the nature of things?
We must
it's very
put
dangerous.
The Tingler back into her body,
and no one will know about it. I've been obsessed with it my whole life. I've neglected my wife.
I've got proof.
I've broken all ethical boundaries, but actually, I was probably a bit wrong with all of that.
Well, his wife she falls in the category of mean but not wrong. She's really trying to save her sister from repeating her mistake, which is to marry a Victor Frankenstein who cares nothing about her. Only actually wants her money to fund his research.
Yeah, that's the other thing. There's two rich women in this. There's the deaf-mute owner of the thing who stashes her money away. And then we also realise that Vincent Price's, the character's wife, is all the money. And there's no kind of, he could have left her at any point, but obviously he needs to fund his research.
Oh, yeah, he's not concerned about her. And she is a 1950s version of feminine sexuality, which means...
And the saxophone comes on almost every time she's on screen.
Every time!
Just to let us know, this is a sexy woman who does not know the boundaries of being a good wife.
She's bad.
Good evening.
I do wish you wouldn't stand around in the dark.
The Tingler makes her maybe a good wife. As
Yeah.
they have a conversation where she toasts to the Tingler and toasts to being the new wife. And I just can't keep a straight face. They named it the Tingler.
They did.
Which reminds me of this whole film. I don't think intends to scare people. So I think it speaks to the brink film phenomena you're talking about. It is an adult film with adult relationships, adultery, and all that. It's pitched, I think, at teenagers who are not taking the movie experience seriously at all and are going to have a good time and going to be played games with, right?
Yeah.
So I think from the beginning with that warning, which in Frankenstein worked as kind of a real thing, I'm going to show you some horrible things. By the time the Tingler comes along, that's just a invitation to play. And the version of stereotypes that Castle plays with are all very, very knowing. The audience who's grown up on TV, reruns, not reruns, but showings of the Universal films and 1930s horror films know these character types.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go out and say it. Nobody was really scared by this movie. But that you don't have to be scared by this film in order to get the most out of it. When I teach this film in class, I make sure to get a student who's not enrolled in class to sit in on the screening and play the role of the fainting woman. And I have two other students who come in and then escort her out. So in the film, when the screen in the film, the Tingler gets out. It gets out in a silent film theater, right? The whole film is set up for this being like the final wonder of the Tingler. Right?
This is the crescendo,
There's a movie theater in a movie in which a Tingler is loose.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's no cause for alarm. A young lady has fainted. She is being attended to by a doctor and is quite all right. So please remain seated.
If you were up for making the maximum amount of money off of your investment as possible and you were a theater owner, you would have set up another speaker in the back of the house. And the projectionist would switch the sound from behind the screen to the back of the house for Vincent Price's announcement. So it sounds like he's in the theater with you. And it works so well in class because nobody believes that. But they're invited to play along. Look, there's their classmate who played along. Then there's another break in the film.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives. The Tingler is loose in this theater, and if you don't scream, it may kill you. Scream! Scream! Keep screaming! Scream for your lives! It's here! It's over here! Help! Help!
Look out, it's under the seat!
Ladies and gentlemen,
It's under the seat!
the Tingler has been paralyzed by your screaming. There is no more danger. We will now resume the showing of the movie.
The shadow of the Tingler in the movie we're watching crawls across a white screen, and it is clear that Tingler is in the building, at which point the projectionist now starts keeping the theater dark, now starts pushing on that buzzer button.
Which is basically, they are fitted every 1 in 10 seats, is it?
Every 10 seats. So the package that went out with you could order packets of 100 buzzers, right? And so you would get these two crates, and they had 100 buzzers
and they'd stick them to the bottom of your seats. Is that right?
They'd screw them to the bottom of the seats. I think 100 was there because most of them were broken. So at least you'll get a few that work. And they did every 10th seat. But the really interesting thing, it wasn't just you push a button and they buzz. There was a delay so that you push the button and then they would buzz in series. It would start in the front row and move its way across and back through the
So like
audience.
A wave of buzzing through the audience.
A wave of buzzing, which creates a wave of screaming. So the first person in the first seat knows they're not screaming because they're scared of the buzzer. They know it's their cue they can scream.
Yeah.
Everybody's been wanting to scream until the end of the movie. Then that moves to the second row. They know it's okay. They can scream. And if you don't have a buzzer, the person next to you is screaming. And so by the end of this 15 seconds of horror, everybody in the audience is screaming. And until you sit in an audience that does that, the film, I don't think makes sense. The first time I did that in class, there was I overheard one student talking to another in hushed tones, like, I heard Professor Higgins scream in class today. And the other student said, "Oh, really? What did it sound like?" And the first student said, "Oh, it was a manly scream." And from that moment, I realized also how gendered screaming was. In horror films, it's the women who scream.
Yeah.
So
scream
as
queens.
a male professor having to model screaming for my class, I hadn't been conscious of this, but I was very concerned about not sounding girly. I needed to give it a manly scream, which I feel like I did,
And you were like, yes, I managed to
Yes,
do that.
I did it. But even that, it's an excuse for boys to scream, which is still unusual. Like the horror film is about the 1950s teen horror film is about women performing femininity so that boys could perform masculinity and comfort their girls and not actually scream. But here, we all get to scream. It's fabulous. It's really great.
I feel bad about not having screamed during my viewing.
You really should.
Just sitting at home by myself.
I wonder whether it is an invitation for men in the audience to comfort their date for the night. That one of the reasons in this period teenagers went to the cinema was that it was warm and dark and away from parents. One wonders whether actually this is about creating an invitation to canoodle. If you'll forgive my my roundabout way of thinking.
Canoodle,
yeah, right. It came out my mouth, and then as I was saying, I thought,
word. No. Oh my god.
But I think part of the function of horror was to allow boys to perform comfort at women who were performing fear. And that was kind of the social contract of going to the cinema on a date, as a heterosexual couple at least. So
it's true. And this film calls that out. There's a masher in the audience of the film who's hitting on a young woman who moves seats because she's more interested in Tolerable David, the silent film that's on the screen. But it models that, right? I mean, I think that's true.
Absolutely.
Though screaming together breaks the ice. So I think it works a lot of ways.
I want to talk a little bit about how they've got the film in the film. It's a silent movie theatre. And there are quite a few nods to the kind of silent era, which is quite again, it seems like it's offering a bit more depth, but it is all kind of for the benefit of performance, I feel.
Well, Martha Higgins, her character reminds me of Zazu Pitts in Greed. And that may be a overeducated film student reading way too much into this. Like, since she's a deaf mute, she does a gestural kind of acting, not ASL by any means, but all of her acting is gesture and face, which harkens back to the silent era.
Right. I mean, it's been said of her before that she's a silent film. That it's a silent film performance kind of trapped in the body of a sound film. So it's ostentatiously signaling an older type of film through the kind of explicit centering of a silent film on a film screen, through the black and whiteness of it, through kind of the gothic that you get encapsulated in the LSD sequences, but also in Vincent Price as a figure. It's harkening back to something. And there's a number of science fiction horror movies from this period that climax or near climax in movie theaters, and all of them are showing an older or different type of film. The movie itself is kind of irrelevant. It's it was a very successful movie. It'd be familiar to people, but it's not a genre film. It's not saying, look, that's an old type of horror, and now you've got a buzz at the bottom of your spine. So to some extent, I think it's kind of it's signaling novelty and newness. In that it's pointing back to older acting styles, to older cinematic styles, and quite explicitly to older films. And then juxtaposing that with films that have buzzers in your seats and are able to mix color into black and white when you least expect it, and all about, LSD and these modern horrors too. So it's doing something interesting in that space. I'm not sure it's doing anything coherent in that space, but it's certainly doing something interesting.
Yeah. But I do think, like, especially the last few scenes where it's the Higginses staring at each other and making these really animated faces, but there's no sound. And you can see kind of flashes of even things like Dr. Caligari or Nosferatu, where, the way she behaves is very, again, animated, which I quite like.
Which is interesting, because what we're talking about there is theatricality, right? It's a theatrical performance style. Silent film acting mirrors kind of theatrical acting of the time much more, because you don't have in theatre acting, you don't have the close-up, right, to communicate emotion and so on. In cinema at the time, you don't have sound to do that. So you perform exaggeratedly in order to communicate across a distance or across a soundless scape. So in a way, given that this is a really theatrical film, both in the gimmicks alongside it, which are theatrical in their very nature, but also in, as you rightly point out, kind of some of the performance styles in Vincent Price's kind of persona, which is itself highly theatrical, in the shoving of the Tingler back into the corpse, which is kind of, dramatizing as a kind of a shadow play almost, right?
Oh, I like that part, yeah.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there is a real theatricality to it that, to some extent, the reason I say I'm not sure it's doing anything coherent in that space is that I'm not sure it's actually overly interested in it. I think this is William Castle. I think this is the showman who loves the theatre.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the legacy now. And Scott, you had mentioned something that made me laugh, that there's a more recent film that's the opposite. You said it was called The Opposite of The Tingler.
Yeah, the opposite of Tingler is A Quiet Place. And it's, in The Quiet Place, the gimmick is you have to be quiet or the monster will kill you. Which I bring that up because it feels a little legacy-like, in that it's let's build a horror film all around this high concept, right? And The Quiet Place then kind of launched that as a thing with stuff like Bird Box. Like, I've got one concept, that one game rule that is going to define my whole horror experience. But when The Quiet Place was playing in theaters, there was Bally, about audiences feeling very awkward about making noise while it was showing, and about popcorn sales going down because they don't want people to hear them eating because everybody is very quiet, which strikes me as maybe true, but also a big come and see the film where you have to be quiet, which is a mirror image of go and see the film where you get to scream.
That's so interesting.
But I think it's all over. I would say so. You've got Quiet Place. We also have things like Blair Witch and the found footage film, which plays a game with the audience and saying, oh, no, this really happened. And the marketing for Blair Witch was to claim that this is truly based on real events. So I think when they played at festivals, they would put up missing posters for like the characters, and it was playing a game with the audience saying, oh, but maybe it's true, which everybody knew it wasn't true. And yet it's that kind of Bally that can make a low budget exploitation film exploitable. William Castle casts a long shadow, but he also is a conductor of a shadow that precedes him, that goes back to the sideshow and the carnival and begging people to come into the tent and be terrified by what they see or what they may not see.
Interesting. Matt, legacy of the film.
There's a legacy of this that runs through the figure of the unethical mad scientist, because the Tingler is a product of the unethical mad science, right? But there's also kind of a body horror about that too, the thing that's in your spine that you never knew.
Oh, good point.
That takes us through to, the thing, and the creatures that you might transform into or that might come out of you, the alien in Alien busting out of the chest and so forth. Given that we frame this, or that I've argued that this is a film between two worlds, a brink film between two ages, those modes of expression of those fears of the moment don't go anywhere. they just lurk around finding different modes until we find ourselves in fears of cyberspace, or fears of bodies, or fears of penetration and so forth, that come out in different eras of horror, but are clearly there from well before the Tingler, and then the Tingler finds the kind of end of the beginning of the atomic age expression of it, if you'll forgive the slightly cumbersome phrasing.
Yeah, quite cumbersome.
If I can add a legacy?
Please.
So John Waters and Rocky Horror Picture Show, right?
Yeah.
So that what this is doing is creating, and I think partly because it is so arch in its melodrama and so arch in the mad scientist stuff, that it's like made to be made fun of, but also not made fun of, but you join in the joke. So Rocky Horror Picture Show becomes that kind of experience. The experience of screaming at the Tingler is not too far, or is a predecessor to the experience of joining with a crowd in that. And I think John Waters then is picking up on the avant-garde edginess that's in Castle and really rejoining it with the subculture in a serious way, right? So polyester that has the smell-o-vision. He gives people cards to scratch off, which is a direct call back to William Castle. And John Waters was one of the kids who would go and try to find which seat had a buzzer in and make sure he sat on it.
And didn't you say you experienced a buzzing seat at some kind of John Waters?
Sure. The John Waters exhibit at the Academy Museum in Los Angeles, a retrospective of John Waters' work and life. I know this, and I'll plug my own archive here. We have the John Waters collection at the Wesleyan Cinema Archives. And so the Academy borrowed lots of our artifacts for this show. One of the things they did, which is not based on our artifacts, was to create, when you walk into the exhibit, you walk into what looks like a chapel, a church with pews, and on screen where a crucifix would be, there are scenes from John Waters films. And so it's very offensive. And in the pews, there are buzzers. So as you sit down, you wait for it to buzz, and you get the whole, it's like the perfect William Castle plus sacrilege equals John Waters, all in one space.
Brilliant. Okay, recommendations for the listener, Scott.
To stay in the sci-fi world, just go and listen to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. William Castle and Orson Welles, they work together, and they come from the same kind of background. Orson Welles is a magician in the end, with a genius aesthetic mind and pretensions to great art. William Castle is a magician carny with none of the aesthetic skill, and I would argue none of the pretension. The Worlds is a great example of Wells just going for it and inviting the audience in to play along, right? And it's Ballyhoo for audio theater. So listen to that, watch the Tingler, and that's my prescription.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
I really love that idea of Ballyhoo for the ears. That's quite fantastic. My recommendation, I'm afraid, is going to be nowhere near as cultured. I was originally toying with Blair Witch because it is just so clearly the modern version of this. But given that we've already discussed that, I'm going to make a much less classy suggestion of Unfriended, which is a horror movie from a few years back, that probably just before the pandemic, maybe a little bit before, just before the pandemic. That was made within, I think it was Skype actually at the time, but it's entirely someone's laptop screen, in which the horror unfolds mediated via the computer screen. And so in terms of kind of inviting people in of familiar spaces that are turned horrific, that question of, is it real? Is it not real? Where do the lines between the viewer and the reality of this kind of sit? Unfriended to me is a really interesting example of it. It's also equally dreadful as a film, as a piece of art, but wonderful and fun and campy and silly and enjoyable if you're willing to let yourself get into that. So Unfriended is my horror recommendation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Great. That's it for this episode. Next episode, we will be focusing on the film The Wasp Woman by Roger Corman. So if you want to find out where you can watch that, head to the show notes. Aside from that, as always, I would appreciate any support you can give to the podcast. The easiest thing you could possibly do is leave a rating or a review in your podcasting app. For $3 or £3 a month, you can subscribe to ad-free versions of the podcast at patreon.com/every sci-fi film. Thank you so much to those people who have signed up. I truly, greatly, really appreciate your support. And I will see you again next time.